Welcome to today's webinar titled Return Reunion Workshop for Spouses. We are thrilled to have David Dupuy with us today. David is currently serving as a Military OneSource call center manager. He has been supporting service members and their families for approximately 20 years. David has served in a variety of capacities to include return and reunion deployment teams, a family therapist, a crisis responder, as well as 5 years overseas. Without further delay, I will turn things over to David Dupuy.
Good afternoon, everyone. So this will be the first seminar that I do, and probably in a series of them. But we'd like to welcome you to the Return and Reunion Workshop for Spouses. What we're going to do today is just go through some slides, and as Stan has said, if you have any questions as we move along, just please send them to him, and he'll get them to me, and we'll get you an answer. And if we can't get an answer today, then we'll make sure that you get one in the future. But before we get started, as everything in the military system and civilian system, we have a disclaimer here. So what we'll do is just read this real quick and then move on to what we're going to do today. So our disclaimer is the appearance of hyperlinks does not constitute endorsement by the Department of Defense or this website or the information, products, or services contained therein. For other than authorized activities such as military exchanges and morale, welfare, and recreation sites, the Department of Defense does not exercise any editorial control over the information you may find in these locations. Such links are provided consistent with the stated purpose of this Department of Defense sponsored webinar. Okay, so that's that. All right, so what we're going to look at today on this short agenda here is we're going to look at homecoming versus reunion because they are very different, and really focus on reunion because that's where a lot of the work will come in the post-deployment stages. So we're going to look at reunion objectives, expectations, communicating during deployment, which will set the platform for the setting up expectations and outlining what the reunion may look like for you and your spouse and your family as well. Look a little bit at intimate relationships, expectations of change, communication tips, feedback, readjustment tips. So we're just going to take a quick look at a lot of these things here. We're going to pack a lot of information into probably a short period of time. So first of all, before we look at reunion, let's understand the differences between homecoming and a reunion. So when we look at homecoming, that is a one-time event usually that lasts about 1 day, 2 days, and it is a time that's filled with joy, it's happiness. We're all happy that we're getting back together. And those are also approached with some expectations, some anticipation, which isn't much different than reunions. But remember, they're just in a shorter time period because we are happy to see our loved ones come home, and they're happy to be home as well. So they're just a joyous time when you're meeting the plane or the ship or picking them up at the airport, wherever you're having your homecoming at and getting home. So it's just a one-time event. It's short-lived. It's a time of joy. Versus the reunion. Now, the reunion is a long process, or it can be a long process, but the point is it is a process that takes place because the service member has been gone for a while, and it does take some transitioning to be able to reintegrate back into the relationship, back into the family. And that I know from my own experience that being even on short deployments, there is a time where we're trying to figure out how do I fit back into the family, what's my new role, what do I pick up, what do I let go, because as the person that's left home, I remember my spouse and I would talk about, she had to pick up all the bills, take care of the child, make sure the rent was paid, all that stuff. So they pick up a lot of extra duties. So there is a time there to figure out, how do we get back into this process? How do we get back into this relationship? How do we just make it all work again? Do we go back to where we were? Are we changed? What? And recognizing that process can be challenging, especially if we've set up some expectations that are unrealistic. We all have ideas about how we want our relationship to be, how we want the family relationships to be, those kinds of things. And, where do you want this responsibility in the family to go? Who's going to take it now? All that. So what are the expectations? Are they realistic? Are they unrealistic? How do you respond to them? Do you get really disappointed, angry, or just happy that somebody else can do it, providing support back and forth again? And then realizing that it's not always perfect. It's a relationship. We always grow, and every good relationship has conflict at some point in time. It's a matter of how we manage that. So sometimes the picture in our head's not always the reality in how the transition should be working out. And this is for a number of reasons. Let's look at communication. You could have a lack of communication. One person doesn't want to communicate as much as the other person. One person wants to over-communicate. So where's the balance? And that communication is a work of art as well, and how it was set up before the person left. How did you communicate when you were on deployment? Will help set the stage during the reunion time of how you communicate as well. And so those skills are always helpful, and they're useful as long as you work on them. The other thing that we have to look at, too, is what's our perception now? Do we perceive that the other person's changed, or have they really changed? If so, what do we work on that? Because those things happen. Family roles. Family roles have definitely changed just by nature of the way that we've had to survive and function with the absence of one person in the family. And then we get these crazy messages in our heads sometimes that say, this really isn't the reality that I left, or this isn't the reality that I expected. Okay, so those can all interfere as we start to think about the reunion. And they're just things to be aware of, because they will come up at some point, and the intensity of those thoughts it's really different from person to person. Sometimes it's more than others. Sometimes you can just roll with the punch and say, okay, that's just the way it is. We can move on. So it's a process. It's challenging. It has its ups and downs. And it's the realization that we're coming back to making some kind of reality for our family. So it's not always perfect. It's, life's not a walk in the park all the time. And that's just part of the process. So we look at some of the objectives for the process. Do we have realistic expectations about the reunion? How do we know if it's really a realistic expectation or not? How do we utilize our resources? How do we get them to help us with the challenges, the adjustment? How do we know the resources are even valuable? We have those kinds of things. So we have to come to a point where we understand that our roles have changed for everyone. Understand that the roles have changed for everyone, and that everyone is trying to figure out, what's this new role that I'm in? What's the new role? What's the new family dynamics that we're bringing back? Is it going back to the way it was? Chances are probably not, because a bit of time has lapsed, which means that we've grown. We've probably learned some things. We've had to survive apart. We have different experiences now. How do we bring those experiences together? And those experiences can help energize the relationship, the family dynamics. So how do we share those? So how do we know that that's all working? How do we understand those challenges? So one of the things is looking at identifying what's a good information referral service in our local area, on our installation, in our community. So what's out there? What can we gain some knowledge from, some experience from? So we make plans to communicate while we're on deployment, and start communicating early as possible about what are your expectations, what are your dreams, what are your desires. So you're kind of laying out a plan. You're developing a plan together that when it comes time, when you transition from homecoming to reunion, that you can transition into something that has a plan and you have some goals and some objectives. So are you talking about things while the deployment's going on, friends, families, curricular activities, those kinds of things? And I think some of the goals and the objectives that you can start to lay out are things like, how do you plan to spend time together? Because you're going to have to reignite that relationship, probably start building it back up where you left off. For some people, you can pick up where you left off. For others, it's a little more difficult. So you have to figure out how that all works together for your own personal relationships. And also understand that there's probably going to be some ups and downs, because that's just the way relationships are. And that doesn't eliminate the process of the reuniting, the reintegrating. There's just going to be ups and downs. And so how do we struggle with those? And if you're struggling with those, then what? Where do you get help? Well, you can look at family services, support services, chaplains, Military OneSource, military family life counselors that are at most locations. So there's lots of resources out there, and we can tap into many of them. It's just a matter of knowing where they're at and how to access them. So that's part of the game plan, and starting to realize some of that. And like we said earlier, communication is vital. It's very, very vital. It's probably one of the most important things we can do, because that's going to help us set up the expectations. So the expectations, we all have them. They're normal, but are they realistic? Well, that would probably be between you and your spouse, or between you and your children and your spouse, to figure out if they're realistic or not. And then the expectations, are they realistic? Are you expecting for life to return to exactly the way it was when the deployment started, or the workups started, and the sailor was in and out of the home during the workups? So what does all that mean to you? And it can be different if the person's only gone for a month or 2 months or a year and a half, whatever. So the process may take a little bit of time. And you're also trying to look at remembering that the reunion is a process. It's independent of many things, such as your needs, your desires, your spouse's needs, their desires. Managing feelings when the expectations are not met or not fulfilled. What do you do then? Well, it seems like the best thing to do is talk about them and share them. You talk about your feelings, talk about expectations with your spouse, but don't get into a mode where you're blaming them because the expectations weren't met, or the anticipation died sooner than it was supposed to. It's good that you can talk about them and then look at those as opportunities for growth to be as an individual, growth as a couple, growth as a family. So all that works together. So the perception of the expectations being met or not met is really a matter of perception. So what is a normal transition from homecoming to reunion? Well, that really depends on the relationship between you and your spouse. The transition period, it will be different for most people, and this will fall back on the communication item, in that if you're communicating with the transition, during the transition or during the deployment even, then you're already setting up what's going to be normal for you and your family. And that, like I said, that's just dependent on everybody. There's no clear-cut answer what's normal, like everything else. Every family develops a routine based on what works for them. So what really works for you and your spouse, your family, may not work for your neighbor, it may not work for anyone else in your family, but that's what it is. And so you have to really communicate about that. Talking is always good. Talk with your friends that have experienced reunions before, trying to get some of that knowledge. That will also help you develop some expectations. Try and read as much that you can about it. There's lots of resources about it, about reunions out there and transitions, during deployments, even PCS and when you're separated. That's all important. So utilizing those resources, utilizing your friends, talking to the chaplain, talking to people at the Family Service Center or support centers, Fleet and Family Service Centers, whichever branch you're attached to, they have family support. So obtaining those resources and just learning about them, and they'll help you start to understand the deployment cycles as well. So you can understand what goes on during post-deployment, and that will also help you create some of those expectations. And really ask yourself, are those realistic or unrealistic? Am I setting myself up, or is this something we can really work out? And only you and your spouse will know that. So we've said a lot about communicating. So you can see from this slide here that we're really talking about, are we talking about, as we start to approach the service member coming home, you need to pick some time during that deployment and talk about what your expectations are, what of the reunion. How are you going to start coming back together? How are responsibilities going to shift? Those kinds of things, as opposed to just talking about the mundane thing. Kids are okay. I went to work today. The kids went to school. We really didn't do anything. Went out to dinner with Sally Mae or Joe Bob or whoever. So you can see that the communication needs to progress from letting the service member know that everything at home is okay, but also moving into a time where you're talking about more substance things of what's going to happen when you get back together. So we can't really say enough about it, about communication, that is. So ask questions, talk with each other, and if you're talking about what you're looking forward to, the byproduct of that is that helps you, that gives you some hints about whether your expectations may be realistic or not realistic. It may also give you some hints about setting up the reunion and developing the plan that's going to work for you and your spouse, those kinds of things. So talking's all good. Talking's all good. And then we have the intimate relationship that some couples struggle with and some people don't. This is another area that it's in the cases that I've seen over the years anyway, and what I've heard is the people that just kind of sometimes, I don't want to say start dating again, but at least they start developing their relationship before they move into the hot and heavy intimate relationships. This is a good thing to be able to talk about, to know what the expectations are, and obviously some of that's based on pre-deployment relationship stuff as well. But where are you going to go now? And what does an intimate relationship really mean to you? Because we know that it's more than a sexual relationship. It's the time that we spend together. It's the walk in the park, just two of us, those kinds of things. The things that really enhance the relationship and draw us closer together. And that's what helps a lot. And sometimes this is difficult in the adjustment period. So you just really need to talk about what the expectations are. And we all know that everybody comes from, when the deployment happens, especially for a long period of time, everybody is experiencing stress. The source of the stress maybe is a little bit different, but we're taking these stressful times and we're trying to come back together and readjust into a normal relationship, whatever that means for us. So it's just really good to be able to talk about those things. And I'm sure you're all sending your questions to Stan by now. So change. It's just, let's face it, deployment causes change. Whether it's 2 weeks long or a year and a half long, there's going to be change that occurs. That's just a normal part of what we've signed up for. So we need to be cognitive, be aware that both parties have changed. You've changed, your spouse has changed, the children have changed, everybody's changed in some way. And the change it doesn't mean that things are bad, it's just that things are different at this point. And then we just have to figure out how to adjust to them. So the perception of change is very important. It's very, very important. Do we see the change as an opportunity to grow individually and or as a family? Okay, so we know that change can provoke growth as long as we see it at that. If we see it as a negative thing, then the chances of not accepting it, turning it into denial, that's not happening, creating some avoidance, all that's going to do is fester into negative outcomes. So the positive outcome comes from a positive perspective. It doesn't take a rocket science to figure that out, does it? And so we have to just look at change as a matter of fact. It is occurring, it's happening, it's nobody's fault, it's just the way it is. So there's no need to blame each other or someone for the change. It's just, the question really becomes, how do we grow from this? What's my responsibility in this change? How do we make it work for our family? How do we make it work for our relationship? So change, we can make it good because it's going to happen. We can either fight it or roll with it. And if we roll with it, then our perception is that it's a good thing for our family. It makes us stronger. Okay, communication tips. Well, first of all, let's just say that communication is basically, we transmit messages either verbally or non-verbally. So non-verbally, verbally is obvious. Verbal is obvious. It's our tone, it's our volume, it's the words we use, it's the timing we use those words, those kinds of things. It's the nonverbal actions, like this picture here. you can see on the slide. They don't look like they're communicating very well, sitting back to back and staring off into space. And she looks a little perturbed, and he looks like he's doing the guy thing about what the heck's going on now. So some of the helpful hints about communicating is making sure, understanding that it's verbal and nonverbal. It's the messages that we send. And the nonverbal messages or actions are the ones that are probably communicated the most, at least the ones that we interpret the most. So I think that some helpful hints. This slide says, you can read it, tune in, listen, give feedback, respond. But I think there's a little more to it than that, in that listening is probably, as a receiver, that's probably the most important thing that you can do as somebody is talking, because it shows them respect, it shows that you're interested. So you really need to be present when the other person is sharing thoughts, ideas, and or their feelings. If we're not present, then it's just a message that whatever they have to say is not that important. And another way that listening is shown is by using a skill called paraphrasing. So what we're doing is just paraphrasing back to the person, to the speaker, what we thought they heard. And this will ensure that I am understanding the speaker as they're talking to me. So if I can't paraphrase back to them what they said, then I'm not understanding what they said. And that gives them an opportunity to explain further about whatever they were talking about, their thoughts or their feelings or whatever, as opposed to parroting. Parroting, to me anyway, parroting is kind of, it's like, yeah, because all you're doing is repeating back. It doesn't really show that you're getting some kind of understanding from what's being said or seeking better understanding. So in that, trying to seek that understanding, another technique that you can use is ask clarifying questions. Clarifying questions is just trying to get people to expand what they're saying so that we can understand it better. So you can say things like, I don't understand, can you say that again? Or what do you mean by that? Or those kinds of things. Or what happened then? So you're trying to get them to expand, or the other way to look at it is you want them to paint you a clearer picture about what they're saying or what they're feeling. So that's another thing. And then as I'm speaking, or as anyone is speaking, as a speaker role, what I want to do is I want to try to be as clear as possible and to be honest as possible, especially when I'm trying to give them feedback or if I'm trying to hear their feedback. I want to stay open. So I want to use statements that contain I. So usually called I statements. I've noticed, or I feel, those kinds of things. You don't want to come out and say, well, you do this all the time, or you do that all the time, or it's your fault that we did this, and it's your fault that it happened this way. It's like, okay, well, let's look at this a little more constructive. When you do A, then I start feeling B, or when you do A, I'm starting to get concerned because my anxiety goes up, or because of this or that. So as long as you're clear and you can use the I statements, that decreases the possibility of conflict as well. And we all know what happens to conflict when it's not constructive. So those are just a few communication tips. Some adjustment tips that we're looking at here is being positive, negotiate activities and roles. And that's kind of an important one, too, because if one person or the other person is always setting up the activities, then there's a possibility that the person always going along is like, well, what the heck's going on here? Why do I always have to do what you want to do? And then you're off and running. You're off to have another conflict or whatever. So tapping into the other person's interest, because when we're in relationships, not everyone has 100% the same interest that the other person does. It's like we all like to do some things, and the other person likes to do some things, and there's some things we like to do together and all that. So work it out so that you're negotiating, well, what if we do this? What if we do that? And it's the same way with the roles, how about you take over the lawn mowing, or how about you take over the bills, or things like that, and I'll pick up this. Or, I know that in our family, whoever cooks doesn't have to do the dishes. That's something we had to negotiate. So one person cooks, one person cleans up. There's just things like that. The other thing to look at as you're looking at roles is to ask yourself, what strengths does this person bring to the relationship? What strengths do you bring to the relationship? And those strengths, if you can sit down and talk about those strengths, you can have clearer definitions of who would fit best in what role in the family and those kinds of things. Now, granted, sometimes life, forces us to play roles we don't want to play, but that's just life. We just get through it. Being patient. Things don't happen overnight. We have to work them out, let them go, not worry about them. Sometimes just let them roll. Reinforce positive changes. Expect transition, unusual feelings. You may have some feelings that you haven't had for a long time or you've never had before, and it's like, whoa, where'd that come from? What is that feeling? And then the most important thing is, if you're struggling through it, ask for help, because there's plenty of help out there, and there's no shame in getting the help. And in fact, over the years, I've heard many people say that the real strength comes when you see people asking for help. And the help can be from your friends. It can be from a professional resource. It can be from informal training. Doing something like this is getting help. It's giving you more skill, more tools, at least more things to think about, I hope. So when we look at the whole thing, we look at homecoming as a joy time. It's a one-time short event, usually day, maybe 2 days. But we soon transition into that reunion, which is an ongoing process, which is also looked at just reintegrating the family back together. Because whenever we add somebody, subtract somebody in the family, it changes the family dynamics. And so the reunion is just redefining what those family dynamics are. And then how do you work from those? And then some of that, as you approach that process, is really evaluating your expectations, anticipation, those kinds of things. And then allow the time for the readjustment to be integrated into the family dynamics, into you personally, into your relationship, those kinds of things. Because the time factor is really unknown for each of us. Because I think it's based more in how your relationship was. Is this the first deployment, second deployment, third deployment? How have you learned how to readjust, not only in deployments, but in other situations? So that time factor is really dictated by your family, your relationship. And, of course, we have to pitch again, don't be afraid to seek support, because there's so much of it out there. Let me take a quick look here. We go to questions.
Dave, we do have some questions.
Maybe we bored everybody.
No, we do have some questions that came in.
Oh, okay. Well, shoot away.
Okay. First question reads, I was pregnant with our first child when my husband deployed. Our daughter is now 15 months, and he's returning next month. How do I get my daughter and my husband to bond?
Oh, good question. I actually thought of that question as I was preparing and reviewing for this. It will be a natural process. The bonding will be a natural process. Part of it will be that the husband understands developmental stages, because at 15 months there's going to be some recognition issues that may occur. But I think that the best thing to do is that the child will see the husband and wife together and interacting, and then that the husband also spends some time with the child, one-on-one time, and starting to lay that platform. So, good question, though.
Okay, thanks. Next question reads,
helpful.
My husband and I haven't been the same since his return. How much time should I wait before we seek help?
If you're feeling like it's a problem, you should probably seek help now. Because I think I know the professionals can help put some things back together for you, or an objective view is always good. So I don't know how much time this person has been back, but if it's starting to feel uncomfortable and you're not feeling like you're making any progress at all, then I would suggest that one or two things happen. Either find some briefings like this to go to that can talk about post-deployment issues, reunion issues, those kinds of things, or go to the support services that are on base. And if they don't want to go on base, they probably have I'm going to assume there's TRICARE in the picture. There's that possibility too. But if you go on base, you've got your family support systems, you got your chaplain. If you're at a larger base, you have your military and family life counselors that can talk with you, which is a good resource. And then there's behavioral health too. But I think for this purpose, either family service support services, or if there's a military family life consultants. The other thing is, if they're eligible for Military OneSource, we can help with some situations as well. So they can just call the Military OneSource and get hooked up with some services there. So I would say access services when you're feeling like there's no more progress made and you don't want to wait around too long.
Okay, great. Next question reads, how do I know if an expectation is realistic?
Well, that's a good question. I think it broadens the question some more, too, but I think the bottom line is talk about it with your spouse and see if it's something you can do. If it's an expectation that can be transformed into reality, then it's probably not unrealistic. But if it's not, if the expectation doesn't have the ability to be transformed into reality for whatever reason, the spouse doesn't want to participate in it, it's out of the reach for whatever reason, those kinds of things, then the probability of it being unrealistic is probably pretty high. So you have to talk about it with your spouse and then figure out if it's something that you can do or not.
Okay, thank you. At this time, we have no more questions in the queue. So I would like to thank you, David, for sharing your invaluable experience and expertise. I would also like to thank our attendees for participating in today's webinar. And if you find yourself having questions after the webinar is over, please email moswebinars@militaryonesource.com, and I'll get the questions over to our presenter and get our answer back to you as quickly as we can. This concludes today's webinar on Return Reunion Workshop for Spouses. Thank you all for attending, and have a great day.